I just wanted to ask you about a few more books. This is from the document I set up last time. Have you read any Tolstoy, any of his short stories like
No,
A Confession or Death of Ivan Ilyich, any of that?
just a long time ago. I don't
Okay.
even remember.
Yeah, okay. Cool. Um, Solzhenitsyn?
No, I don't know that one either.
No. Josh Waitzkin wrote about the art of learning?
Doesn't sound familiar.
No. Any meditation books that are not very woo-woo?
None that I really know of that are ideal.
Yeah,
I mean,
okay.
I would just look on Google for some resources.
No, it's okay. It's all right. I just was curious if
But
you read
other
this
than
one
that,
because I had that
no, I
recommended.
don't know that.
Um, I know Leonard Peikoff has lecture series on communication. I forgot what it's called, the art of communication. I don't remember, but
I
whatever.
think so.
He's got a lecture series on it.
Yep.
Have you done that?
No, I've
Okay.
only done the epistemology stuff.
Okay. Because I was curious if it's objective communication. That's what it's called. Um, yeah, like if it would be like obviously one part of communication is writing, but I was wondering if there is application from these specific lecture series or just an objective view of communication in general to actual conversation and speaking with people. So when you're speaking to a friend or speaking to someone, making sure they have and making sure you're consciously aware of what the relevant context might be in the things you say. And so I was thinking about that, but if you haven't done the course,
No, I don't know what he says on it.
okay. All right, cool. So we can. So I redid this whole thing and it's like huge now. Some of these I still need to work out a lot. Like there's still a lot that's a part of what I was doing in my time off is also just trying to figure out what going forward, what exactly I want. Um, so maybe I've thought about this. I didn't quite get an answer yet, but like if it's a question of, isn't there sometimes a question of when you're studying something or pursuing something, a question of curiosity slash interest versus concrete goal? Because um, like it's quite hard to have a very concrete, specific outcome for studying philosophy. Like it's not, oh, I'm going to study philosophy, and by the time I'm done, I'm going to have $10,000. You're like, it doesn't really work that way in philosophy. It's hard to get any, like when I said one of my goals was to improve my thinking, that's still not concrete. Like, what does improve look like? What point? And
Right.
so have you given any thought to like when you pursue a subject, if it's abstract, like how do you think in terms of should I set a concrete goal or should I just put this aside as an interest and curiosity? If you've
I
thought of, I
think
don't know if you've thought about that at all, so we can skip if not.
curiosity, I think of a lot as a way of seeking out knowledge on things for better thinking. Like you're curious because it helps you think better, use your cognition better by seeking out this information. I think usually think of it in terms of that, but I do think concretes help, or at least the wider context of why you like learning things. For what end does it go to? Is it just, I mean, you wouldn't want to do it just for like, oh, I do better at bar trivia or something.
I
I
do
mean, that's
what?
not a really bar trivia.
Oh,
Well, at least,
okay.
yeah, just, I mean, it would help with that, but like, that's not really worthwhile. I mean, concrete could be like, I'm applying it to, well, think about this career better, or pursue this in my career, or
Right.
chase a new career, or
Yeah.
whichever direction it might be.
Oh
It can
yeah.
at least organize that.
Yeah, actually. Since philosophy is broad, it applies to everything. Um,
Yeah.
how would you measure, like, if we're talking about thinking principles for creativity? How would you like? Part of what I've done is record everything, so I can go back. But then, what are other ways to measure results? Like, how do you, I can see some little changes, but it's not like, it would be like, I can't tell yet if they're just little and remain little, or if it's like that. I don't know if you saw that post I made in HBL, but like, it's like a pregnant woman who you can only tell after like 10 months, oh, wow, I think so differently now. Like, what are other ways to, if you know of any, to be able to tell if, let's say you've given me these methods and principles for thinking creatively and I start applying them, and then like, how would you know, what's a way to measure the result basically?
Well, there's several ways. One would, of course, is more a subjective measure, just how do you feel compared to 2 weeks
Right,
ago? Do you feel clearer or less clear? And
right,
that's one measure, not the only one you should use. Other measures would be, say, related to the actual goal. Say, if it's, I can't think of a good example. Say, if you like to write nonfiction, are you able to write quicker, or can you write 500 words quicker than before? That's one way you can measure,
yeah,
like the speed in which you produce your ideas.
yeah,
Or even
quality
another
of
way
the
to measure
ideas.
is number of answers you can, like speed on solving, I don't know, problems, which might not apply to a lot, but say if you like solving puzzles, or if
Yeah,
you're a mathematician, it might be relevant to an amount of problems you can go through and how fast. Another thing might be how many answers you can even come up with. That might be relevant to, say, if you're a comedy writer, you would want a large amount of ideas usually to
yeah,
output a lot, and see if you can make more ideas than the previous week. You can say you're improving your, at least your creative thinking. Are you improving all of these
right,
other goals?
right.
I think other ways you can measure. You could measure in terms of,
Well, if I was writing every week, and then I look back at, that's, I mean, there's video and then there's writing every week, specific to some concrete purpose.
yeah. And usually if it's something you kept up with as a habit, usually you can tell pretty easily in what way you're succeeding or in what way
Right,
you're improving. Like I can look at stories I wrote like 10 years ago and it's a different quality than what I write now. Like
right,
I can see an improvement in what I've done.
right. What have you ever thought of a metaphor for? I don't know if there's a metaphor, but when you study something and your studying it improves the way you study it, meaning like I'm studying philosophy, and then almost like the identification of improvement is, does my study of philosophy improve? So I'm studying philosophy to improve studying philosophy. And then if I'm suddenly approaching it differently, asking better quality questions, focusing in on the relevant details more often, that is like studying philosophy and thinking methods to improve thinking methods and studying philosophy. I don't know if that makes sense, but
And they do feed into each other for
yeah,
sure. It's just trying to keep in mind the context of where these apply anyway. Like, I mean, studying more thinking habits will, just like any skill, like you build it up. The more
yeah,
you use it, the more you think about it. Then the more you think about it, the more you can use it, and
yeah,
so on and so on. It
yeah.
just builds up.
Okay. All right. Um, so this question here is more for me, actually. These are open-ended questions that I wrote. I was like, I need to, this idea of a central purpose is quite difficult, because to abstract, to identify some overarching goal and then relate everything to it, I don't know. Do you find that, how do you find that? Like, there's so many random things you can do, but there's not necessarily an easy way to evaluate them in relation to each other. And there's also not an easy way, at least that so far I've been able to identify, evaluate what is and isn't more important. Like, for example, let's say right now you're working, your goal is to, I don't know. I'm trying. Maybe I'll just think of an example for myself. Let's say my goal is to study philosophy. Like, to then integrate. Oh well, I also really like surfing, or I really like this, or I want to go rock climbing, or I want to, like, to integrate those things is not easy at all. it's not self-evident. It's not, and to weigh different values against each other is not, doesn't seem to be obvious at all. So that, is there much on that? Because I haven't found it. Like I looked up a lot of stuff on central purpose, and there hasn't been that much that I've been able to find apart from some post by a guy from years ago.
I would think, well, as far as some special science on it, psychology, there's Ed Locke, and he deals a lot with
Who?
purpose. Ed Locke, the
Oh,
objectivist,
oh,
he writes a lot about that.
oh.
Locke. Yeah, he writes plenty about that. I don't know much to say other than, well, some general principles, like you break down a problem into many other problems. So even if you don't know the answer, what is my purpose in life, you could break it down at least to start. It does take a while to figure out, even if the question itself is pretty straightforward. Wait, it's not. It only takes, I don't know, 8 words to ask the question. But I think it's very slow and takes a lot of time, even though it seems like you only need to know a few things. But sometimes it does take into account that you need to go out and try something before you're really sure.
Right.
Like go out and try rock climbing and see actually what happens when you do it. You can't predict everything. There is uncertainty there. And in a way, looking at open-ended questions that are so long range and big, you got to admit that you don't know a lot. And that's part of your gathering
That's true.
information. You got to get the evidence first. And then you have more to think about. And
But
the more you
then,
do, the easier it is.
okay, but then let's say you do two things. Is the standard then for evaluating which one is a higher value to you if you enjoy one more than the other? Like let's say two similar things. So meaning hobbies rather than actual work. But let's say you're
Sure.
deciding between playing a computer game or learning to play piano. And so you enjoy both and you found piano a bit more painful to learn. So actually that would, if it, so maybe emotion isn't a good way to decide. But what I mean is like, just because you do something doesn't necessarily tell you, like if I started learning piano and I found it painful and then I'm like, oh, maybe I should play a video game instead. Just because I learned to play piano doesn't really tell me if I should, um, play piano as a hobby. I don't know if that makes sense. Does that make sense to you?
Kind of. I
Because
mean,
what would the benefit, like let's say you go out and try something and you tried two different activities and one of them is more fun than the other. That doesn't necessarily mean you should do the one that's more fun, right?
right, I agree. It's not necessarily just what's more fun.
Right.
That's part of the issue, that even by doing it, you can discover, or you can discover what ways it could apply to your life. That it's not even just the pain or displeasure you had. I mean, just consider that you played piano. Then, well, what else did you learn about it? I think you would learn to what extent you feel comfortable using that way of thinking, or to what extent you think you can apply it to other skills you've done, or even simply to what degree do you feel
Right.
impassioned by doing it, or
Right.
maybe start thinking about like Beethoven, you're really interested in that, or you think about how Franz Liszt played and you are inspired by that. Even like in spite of the pain, even you could say, oh, I like what this could become by this long range thinking.
Right.
That would be an example. Maybe you want to broaden your focus and think about, well, after now that I've tried it and I've felt what it's like, how do I relate this to other things, to my future, to my other goals, or even this other hobby? And you can compare it to a hobby. Like you experience the other hobby, see what way does it make you feel? What do you think of? What ideas come to mind? In what way is it impacting your life? Then it'd be a few steps from there. You have to think of, well, it'd be more about the details of the situation, because certain things can become addictive, even like video games. You could acknowledge that, well, is some of this feeling because I've been playing too much? Is my life being affected in these other ways? Like we start to get into more contextual questions. Like it really depends on what sort of activity you're doing to know how to analyze it. I mean, from that might come experience. Like, how do you analyze, say, playing an instrument? How do you analyze games? How do you analyze, say, working out? I mean, each of those things can have a different way of even thinking. I think working out would have different standards completely than the standards you would use of, say, choosing what TV show to watch.
Yeah.
Totally different standards.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. But then knowing how to relate different values is, I don't know if I just looked up some of Edwin Locke's goals there. I can see there's, man, some of these are, what the hell, 287 for one of his books because there's no Kindle.
Yeah, I know.
what is that? But
I'm sure if you look up some of his papers, like I'm sure you could even ask him if you could read something, because usually those things are really, the author can send anything they would like.
Oh, I see.
If you have a specific question, like you specifically want to read an article he published, because he is a published psychologist. I mean, it's not like he's a fringe at all. Like he's did pretty good work in organizational psychology is what he did.
Okay, I might post here. Yeah, okay. I will ask about that. What about, do you know if so there's goal setting, but then what about relating, you're talking about different things you pursue you need to think about them completely differently. But then what you're saying captures the fact that it is very difficult also to relate. Like, how does me going to gym, for example, relate to me playing video games? Or how do you weigh those different values? Like I couldn't find much about thinking about that better as well. I don't know if that's going to be covered by goals.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I don't think it would be completely. I think intuition has to do with this.
Yeah.
I'm not sure to give a great answer with intuition, other than you can use it. Just don't say it's your means for knowing things. It's just a way to make decisions, or at least get started on something. That if you don't know what to think about these things, really all you can do is just go off your intuition and try it out and see what happens.
Right.
I'm just a big believer in just trying it out and see what happens.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm probably more, I'm empiricist in some ways and rationalist in some ways. So,
yeah.
Okay, cool. Let's see okay. So one of the things, the goals that I had was productivity and intelligence. But then when I thought about it, it's more, this is psychology and biographies, or self-help. It's not really a philosophical goal. Like, even the example you gave earlier of the monk being able to direct his attention, the fact, all philosophy will tell me is that I can direct my attention, but it's not going to tell me what method, apart from some very basic methods, which I posted about, it's not going to tell me anything beyond that. And so this does seem to, would I be right in saying the only way I pick up something like this, so cultivating certain habits that are fundamental, would be psychology, biographies, or self-help, not philosophy?
Mostly not philosophy. Philosophy gives you some, but if you really don't want to know the way to do it, the how, you do need something more than philosophy. And philosophy won't tell you the how.
Yeah, okay.
Just research for the how. Or you need whatever it is, you need to do research to find out. That's how I phrase the difference. You need to go and see what other people have investigated, and that would be the best way.
And then what would be the role of philosophy in that?
Well, epistemology, how to frame the questions, in what way to consider what a concept is, in what way what is the nature of man, in what way should values relate to your life, things like that, more like how to fit it in, rather than just grabbing things that, that feels cool, I want to use that. No, this can allow us to integrate it into our lives.
Right. If I set a goal of understanding what reason can do and the role it plays in worldly success, how, I thought about, is this I was wondering to myself, how clear of a goal is this? Because I know to some extent what reason can do, but all I did was come up with 5 to 10. I said I should be able to think about 5 to 10 detailed varied examples from different fields. So piano to business to basketball, basically, because they're completely different, and see how it varies in each of those. And that might mean studying, right? Like looking at a biography of a basketball player or something like that.
Yes.
But if I set a goal like this for philosophy, maybe that is clear. Maybe it would be I just have to write an essay about 5 essays about the role of reason in piano, the role of reason in physics, the role of reason is in basketball, and then that would be that's pretty clear actually. What thoughts on that?
I think so. Just you could identify the overall goal of this particular goal, identifying the nature of reason. Then you
Right.
break down into sub goals, like how do I attain the knowledge about the general knowledge about the other things. So it will be a bit of back and forth between, I study a little bit about piano, then I generalize, study a bit again about something else, then I generalize. You
Right.
got to go back and forth. You can't just say,
Right.
I'm going to learn all this stuff, then I integrate. No, you got to, it's a back and forth. You learn some things, integrate them. Learn some
Right.
more, integrate more. Learn more, integrate more.
Okay. All right. And then the same thing for those fundamental methods that I wrote about.
Yeah.
Like completely imagine maybe if it's a project, if it's fundamental, it should apply to anything. But for 5 to 10 different examples of how I apply reason and just like write an essay about it, basically, how reason was applied. Well, what are some other ways you think?
Well, one obviously direct way, write an essay. That's one way.
Yeah.
Two, what else can you do? How can you apply this? Well, teach somebody else is a good.
Oh yeah.
Learning.
Oh yeah. Teach someone else. Oh, I didn't think about that actually. That's a good idea.
Could be. Well, depending on the concept, you could make art. Like, could be like, maybe you can write a story. I just like that because it's something I tend to think of.
Yeah.
Depends on the subject, of course.
Yeah, go on. Sorry.
Like, I mean, maybe you want to be thinking about, say, what's the nature of music? I mean, to some extent, you might want to try making music, even if you've never done it before. Just do it a little bit because it gives you something to think about.
Yeah,
I've something actual.
Yeah.
Or whatever. Just like any more, I think really depend on the subject as far as abstract stuff. Essays and teaching other people, I think, usually are the best way.
Right. Okay. So I got that. Let's see what else I changed here. Yeah, I think this is vague. Like when I say something like cultivate confidence in my reasoning, that's psychology.
Yeah.
That's not, I don't think that's philosophy anymore. So I will just, because I did it and yeah, it's derivative. I did it and then I looked at it later. I'm like, well, these sound good, but some of them are pretty, like, what does it mean to, when I looked at this and I said to start habituating the methods of thinking self-consciously, like self-consciously by applying, or start habituating the methods of thinking but by self-consciously applying them. Like, just if that's the case, then I've already started. Started just means you have a list and you apply it day to day.
Yeah, I mean, this is almost an example of reorganizing your concepts. You're identifying what's more fundamental than others. I mean, these things you could say are derivative. They're like a sub-consideration. I don't know how you organize it necessarily, but it's something more narrower than reasoning. You're putting it lower in the hierarchy.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not like that knowledge is irrelevant. It's just merely moved to a different place that you realize it's maybe less important than you thought, and that's what's going on.
Yeah, there was one other thing that I was. Okay, so some of these we've talked before. Now I've just set a goal of like written examples for each principle or whatever, where it's being applied by me or something else. But then I had one about, and I'm not sure now that I've studied more, I'm not sure this is philosophy, but to learn what it means to think and plan long range. So weeks, months, years, and a whole lifetime ahead. And then I'm like, well, is that even possible? Like philosophy gives you principles, but it doesn't really let you visualize what the future is like or what you want long term, like, or what kind of things can and should be planned, or like how does one mentally hold that kind of range and the many possibilities in it, if that's even possible. And then I thought, isn't that's like self-improvement and psychology? It's almost like biographies as well, to learn what other people who, let's say, impress you do. Would you agree with my take on that? This kind of thing of like thinking long range, you know, is not philosophy. Like the philosophy is thinking long range in principle. So it just tells you do this because long range, it's good for your flourishing. But it doesn't tell you like, well, how do you imagine what you want in 5 years and how you'll get there? Like that's not, philosophy doesn't do that.
Yeah, you could say it's that this is applying that principle that if you are thinking long range, there is a philosophy behind it. There is philosophy is how we attain some kind of long range thinking.
Right.
And they can narrow that down to what are the different kinds of long range thinking? What are the different ways people can think? So it'd be a little bit of psychology, a little bit of philosophy. You're saying, in a way, you're saying what kind of philosophy they hold. But you're saying also, in what way does their philosophy influence their long range behavior?
Yeah. Okay.
Like I could ask somebody like if they are Stalinists, how would that affect their philosophy on life? How would that affect, I don't know, the sort of goals they would have? Even? Or how would you compare that with maybe, say, a Christian Protestant who's, how would you think about their long range goals in relation to philosophy?
Right.
And like the biography would give you more like the details, the specifics, the concretes, but the philosophy is how to integrate it into something wider. That's namely that there is a philosophy that guides people, rightly or wrongly, and there's certain good ones, there's better ones, there's different
Right.
kinds.
Right. Okay. So you're saying the philosophy almost, if you do think long range, then philosophy is almost setting the terms for that long range thinking, like the kind of thing you're going to strive for, if at all. But it's
Yeah,
not, the actual thinking about it and planning for it does seem to be more psychology than,
yeah.
or some other field, not philosophy.
That's more like the objectivist way of thinking. Like that philosophy is the guiding force behind all these goals and the way you decide what's right, even what sets your subconscious in the right direction. That beginning here is where you get the right outcomes, right behavior, right
Right.
quality of life.
Right. Um, well, actually, doesn't psychology, I know psychology, there's some books in psychology about happiness. I think I started going through, I'll see if I can find the name, which do seem to talk about, let me see, what was it? Jonathan Haidt, the happiness
Yeah.
hypothesis. And so he does, I haven't read much of it. I'm only about, and I put it aside ages ago, I'm only like less than 10% of the way in. But it seems like there's a lot of psychology books on identifying those areas of aspects of someone's life that does tend to bring more long-term happiness. Like, for example, what brings someone meaning? Well, work has been identified as one, good quality sleep, like all those things. So psychology does seem to also it's almost playing the role of philosophy in some sense, right? Because it's setting
Yeah.
terms of like, well, you should aim to have this and that.
Yeah. I think a lot of philosophy or psychology is right on that line. It's really hard to tell sometimes.
Right.
Usually I just think of it in terms of is there a wide principle that doesn't necessarily mean like researching like correlations and whatnot, but the
Yeah.
research is taking those concepts and they're very vague concepts. So you need a lot of philosophy to define your terms, to make it clear. And I think plenty of psychologists try to. They use philosophy to define what they're talking about. And in some way they begin with philosophy. If they're good, they'll start with something like oh, this thinker, this philosopher began here and we're building on that into a science.
Right.
That's where it gets fuzzy. Depends on the person.
Um, with this thing about organizing interests into a consciously held hierarchy. That you mentioned Edward Locke on goals specifically, but
Yeah.
even this, I don't know how much of that is philosophy. I think more of that is psychology almost
Yes.
than philosophy. Like thinking about what I like more. Do I like this person more, that person more? That's psychology, not and how to and then applying. Like philosophy is just telling me you can measure emotions, you can create a hierarchy of values, but doesn't necessarily tell you how, like give you then a method for, oh, when you feel this, or this is this feeling. It doesn't give you any sort of rule book, really. You
Yeah,
mentioned
it gets,
intuition.
yeah. Yeah, there's no rule book. But I wish I could just set a line for a philosophy is really just the widest general principles. And psychology often uses those. Um, I mean, philosophy does tell you some methods of general rationality. What are ways to be rational? Like, don't use emotion as a means of cognition. That's definitely a principle in
Yeah.
a positive recommendation or a normative claim there. I guess it more becomes psychology when you need an experiment to verify it, like saying, in what way does having an easy upbringing make you more inclined to be happy? Like if you're born in a rich family, does that make happiness easier? Does it make happiness
Right.
harder? You would need an
Right.
experiment, really. You could use philosophy to just phrase the question or to set the terms, but only psychology will answer for sure with the research. Say what happens, because it's with objectivism it can be tricky because a lot of objectivist principles relate to empirical knowledge and you can't divorce it from that. So that's within objectivism it can be a bit tricky to find the line between the two because you can't do good philosophy without observing the world.
Yeah.
Any it's not like Kant who probably would say that if you need to observe the world as if that's necessary, then we might not necessarily call that philosophy. But if you can do it purely by thinking, they have that distinction. But objectivism can't use that. It's more like it's not just empirical or is it not? It's all empirical, but
Right.
to what extent is it require something special? Which I would just say experimental method is what makes it something else.
Right. Right. And it turns it into a non-philosophic or well, it's still a science, but because philosophy is still a science, but it's just what requires specialized study, what doesn't.
Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to ask you, there's some books on so I mean, we discussed mnemonics, for example, but like, let's say you've got okay, you've consciously agreed with certain principles and you're like, this makes sense, I want to apply it, but then you want to be able to like systematically apply it day to day. And for that, you almost need mnemonics. Like, for example, I tried to, or some kind of psychological techniques to then take this knowledge you have and apply it and then make it a regular thing. Doesn't seem to be, it seems to be heading, into psychology again, because what was the example? I'll just see if I can find it. I read Atomic Habits, and then I tried to turn the principles into mnemonics so I could remember them and then like think about applying them in different situations. But the whole process of doing that and like turning them into, putting them in a certain order and then being able to access them when I need, like that's not philosophy anymore, right? That's again psychology.
For that in particular, yeah, because it's such a particular skill.
Right.
I would almost think of it's like, philosophy can tell you something that, concepts help organize things, and
Crow.
that's some principle. But beyond that, say it'd be more like learning basketball. Philosophy could help you, but it's still very specific to basketball, where you got to use these physical skills. It's not purely a rational skill. That's the thing about mnemonics. Some of it's just literally just a training regimen, and you just learn some techniques. Like in swimming, some techniques you just do if you need to accomplish something. It's not about whether like you're in rational control every second of it, but that there is
Yeah.
a method that will, so you can store the information like you want. I mean,
Right.
I don't think it's any different than like you learn how to write an alphabet to write down your notes, or you learn a sort of type of stenographer's text or stenographer's writing to write
Yeah.
quicker. It's not that it's a thinking habit, but these are techniques you can use to be more efficient with what you have.
Yeah. Yeah. It does get a bit, when you describe non-rational learning, I like swimming is a good example. It does blur a bit because how much, obviously some of the methods set the terms, but then you've got to make individual empirical observations in that field, and there may be, I don't know, it's less obvious basically what.
A philosophy can tell you what it is. Maybe you're thinking about, like, are we thinking about concepts? Are we thinking about sensations? Are you thinking about just movement, motor movement, and
Right.
things like that? I mean, philosophy can help you identify that.
Yeah.
And concepts usually are appropriate for philosophy. Like, are they units? Are they discrete things? Are they imagined? Or are they just merely like metaphors like Nietzsche would have us believe? I mean, it can tell us that. And from there, then we could figure out what mnemonics might seem appropriate, or what mnemonics seem consistent with that, where we can acknowledge that these facts about them, but then create a new technique very specific to the information you want, or what you want to learn, or
Right.
to use specifically.
Okay, let's see if there's anything else in here. I wrote down some free will. I just have to go through more lectures and ask more questions. There's no specific I said project, but I've got to figure that out.
Yeah.
And then integration practices, if you've got any comments on that. I wrote down some ideas of what I call integration practice. So written reflections over events in fiction and identify the abstractions in them using everything I learn. So like if I read a book, it's like, what are the principles behind this character or behind these events, which I haven't done.
Yeah.
And so, as I'm going through art, consuming art, then consume it more actively and do that. And then I'm going to do personally reflections on the week applying. I've listed out some principles that I've learned about so far, like thinking methods, epistemological principles. I'm going to reflect on the week in relation to them. And then learning to write, which is what motivated that question about writing for yourself that I asked you about before. Okay, cool. That's my updated. And I'm going to try. I still want to go through that for myself and clarify it to be more precise. But then when I work, it'll be in relation to that, and it can change. But that's what I've done so far. Okay.
Let me see that last one really quick. All right, no problem.
Yeah. I'll open it. It's fine.
I just want to check something. That's fine. Just don't overwhelm yourself with the amount of information. But I like the first one. I think that one's particularly good. I mean, it could just be a paragraph or two about, say, a movie you watched. That's all you really need, and usually just get your ideas out, so you at least can go back to it later.
Right.
At least it concretizes even once you put it down. Much better than just floating in your head.
Right.
Beyond
Even
that,
if there are open-ended questions, that's fine. I'll just
Yeah.
put it all down.
Yeah, it's better to have the question there and answered later than just not even putting it there.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I might do that. I'll do it like a little blog or something. And then as I watch, like when I watched Equilibrium, that's why I chatted to you about it, because I watched it and I actually wrote down, I consciously reflected over it. And then I've been trying to do that. So, all right, good.
There was a technique that Richard Feynman used with reading new things or learning things. Like, he'd always think of questions to ask. Like, just think of questions is something that's going to be useful.
But before or after, you mean?
After. Like,
Because
sometimes I've noticed it helps me sometimes. Like, if I don't know what to write, well, I could at least write down some questions. Like, what does this mean? What do I want to learn more about, say? And things are tangentially related. Like, I want to learn more about I don't know, skydiving because this character skydives. I mean, you're just like getting questions out and getting your mind to be in that question mode, which
Got
I
it.
think you're good at already. So, but that's a good thing if you ever feel stuck.
Well, do you know, it's funny. You said I'm good at it already, but that's because I consciously started doing that after reading. I can't remember what I read. It was some essay because I didn't do that
Uh,
before. I would just passively sit and like I
uh,
was much more passive. But I started doing that when anyway, it was either a Rand essay or Peek Off, or I think I started reading some of these books before I spoke to you as well, right?
yeah,
And so it was definitely the influence of trying to consciously apply, oh, thinking is a conscious process, as obvious as that sounds.
yeah,
And then I was like, all right, well, that means I just have to ask lots of questions. And so it was, that was because of reading this, basically,
yeah,
philosophy. So cool.
yeah.
All right. Well, we can go continue some of the questions I had from last time. And then I've also got Ito, which we can, I don't know if we'll have time, but if we have time, we can go into that. Okay, so we talked about, just as a reminder, we did speak about this, like definitions in a proposition and how it functions, and then like how badly defined concepts affects thinking in the proposition. You talked about speed, I think, and
Yeah.
not getting the right information. And then I got more random questions here. So context, if I copy the definition of context from Ayn lexicon, it says the sum of cognitive elements, conditioning, an item of knowledge. But then I'm like, well, how does that even integrate into the rest of my knowledge? Like, oh, genus is a sum. Oh, okay, right. Algebra, sum. Like it doesn't suddenly I find at least if I take their definition, if this is a definition, it's confused. And I find this issue repeats whenever I'm finding the genus of a lot of abstractions.
Conditioning and item. Um,
You know what I'm saying? Like what now?
yeah,
So what in your mind, context is stored under sum, and you're like, oh, sum, and everything that's sum is connects to so many random other things that it doesn't really. I don't know. It's weird. Sum is almost a context as well.
yeah. I don't like the word sum. I don't like that definition much. But I get what it means, but I feel like the word sum isn't the best way to define it.
Yeah.
Based on my definition, mine's slightly different. Is not. I mean, conditioning an item of knowledge. I don't like that wording, but that's true. I agree with it. I mean, it's what sets the terms of your knowledge. It's conditioning in the sense that um, they set conditions of your knowledge. In what circumstances is this true? In what circumstances is that true? And what way it can be generalized or not? It sets the boundaries. So you say I usually think about the environment and the environment that um, sets the boundaries of knowledge.
Okay. Well,
Something
let's
like that.
take that as an example. Even that.
Yeah.
My issue is that if I then put, okay, context is a type of environment, like environment includes trees, it includes CO2, like in your
Yeah.
mind at least, there's a lot of other things filed under um, environment, and it doesn't become as clean as I've understood this method
Yeah.
is supposed to be, and I keep finding that as I'm trying to clarify certain concepts. I'm like, well, okay, I sort of see how I can pinpoint more of the essence, but whenever it's not integrated in the sense that, yeah, if I use like sum or environment and this is one example, I could go many more, which we don't need to get into, but yeah, I keep finding this to be the case where the knowledge actually doesn't seem to connect that well. Like it's filed under something that contains so many other random, not fully related concretes, like, uh, you know, um, yeah, now context in your mind is environment. Okay, Greenpeace, context is Greenpeace. Like there's a lot of random, like I
Yeah.
don't know how much that helps your thinking.
Thinking if there's, I've had trouble with defining it in the past, kind of because I'm not sure exactly what the genus is. I think you're right. That's hard to find the genus because it's so almost ubiquitous, I think is the problem here. That compared to many other concepts, this one seems very unique. Um,
Well, I could give you many others that are not as complicated a context, and they're just as bad in terms of like genus being. If you try and when you're trying to find their genus, it's very easy to just to get something that is connected to heaps of other things that are clearly not that related. Like, and yeah, I mean, it's not. I don't really see unless you can perfectly identify some genus that's only relevant in some context and then switch it when you need to. Like, this method of doing the genus differential definition, this is, there's some issues for me.
I would say a set of information of some kind is the genus.
So a set. So if the
Yes.
genus is a set, then now I'm like, context and real analysis in mathematics. And then like in my mind, I associate it with all this other stuff. Set.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I mean, like a set of elements. And you can call it a group, and a group is a unit, and then a unit will so on from there. That's how I think of it. Because we know it's a grouping of stuff, but I don't know what to call grouping, but we could just call it a grouping. I like the word set for groupings. You could use a different term, but I like the word groupings. Or I mean, I like the word set. I mean, it wouldn't be bad if it went to math. I mean, set theory is, I think, quite accurate to relate this to, but you could pick other words. But the idea being that there's a lot of elements, and you want to see the context includes whatever those elements are. So at least more broadly speaking, it's a set of elements. The differential, well, what are special about these elements? Do I say it's an environment? When I say environment, what do I mean? Do I mean like perceptual information? What is it, cognitive elements? But at least the genus helps you set your thinking a little bit, that you think a set of information or a grouping of elements. And then you can try to figure out, well, what am I distinguishing it from? From there, I mean, that's what you would have to do if you really want to get it precise. And that's what I would do anyway.
It's strange that we can like, I can tell you what something is. I can list some characteristics about it, but I can't identify the genus. There's a lot of concepts like that where you can only identify it by finding an extreme, like knowledge, ignorance. But then is the genus, there's no, like, it's not easy to identify the genus is what I'm saying. I keep finding that to be the case. Even if you know what the thing refers to roughly.
Yeah, I agree. I think sometimes you can acknowledge that it might be not always a genus that you can use, depending on the relationship you're thinking of. I mean, genus is one obvious way, but association can be relevant, or indirect connections could be relevant. Right. It's hard to know the different ways, or you could say it's an element of an individual item, or there's different ways you can think of it. The genus and differential is only one aspect of the hierarchy, but then you can organize related concepts. It gets complicated, but the point is it doesn't have to strictly be genus differential for everything. Sometimes the best relationship you can identify right now isn't of that kind, but if you want a definition, it should be genus differential, because that organizes it better, I think.
I agree if you can get the genus, I agree. With the association, this might be going a little bit off topic of these concepts, but the reason why I think associations work so well is because you'll have, when you get exposure to the concept, it'll be in different contexts. So like, one day you're walking down the street and you're talking to a friend and you're happy, and then they use some word and you're like, oh, that's what that is. And then in a different context, I don't know, you'll be in some dark room and it's scary, and all those different contexts give you like good associations that are more memorable. But if I'm just sitting here and reading philosophy texts about abstract concepts, it's really hard to like, it doesn't stick in the same way. It doesn't, and you can't do anything in the sense that you can't, like, if you're studying a subject, you can do experiments and you can like look through a microscope, but in philosophy, you can't really do anything apart from just thinking, which is hard to then get certain concepts burned into your brain.
Yeah, I think that associative thinking can be important because you can actually make objective relationships. I mean, association doesn't have to just only be thought of as random associations. Directed associations are very useful. Like deciding what the associations are. You can decide that maybe in context, you can decide what it reminds you of. You can decide an image or thought or idea that goes with it that might remind you of the right things. Or sometimes it could even help you think of actually the genus later. Like you can start at least with the examples, or you can start with just related things that seem related. It's at least a way to start your thinking up from nothing.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things in there. So one would just be, I guess, that tool, which I forgot to write down, but thinking by analogy and like making that some kind of self-conscious practice, which I could probably add to my fundamental thinking methods. I think that's one of them, thinking through analogy, right? I've seen that somewhere, maybe Dennett.
Probably.
And then the other part with association was, I guess a concept, an entity, or an interaction between entities or whatever, like has a lot of characteristics, and the fundamental is one of them, but association can be other ones that maybe aren't as significant, but they're still there, right? So
yeah, I mean, it's at least a correlation. At least you can see the beginnings of a connection and work from there. It's something to work with.
Right. Okay. By the way, with thinking by analogy, do you know of anything else where there's like an index of all these things, like thinking by analogy or using metaphor, or like just a day-to-day, like if I want to find a compound word for field, like applying those kind of tricks as well? Because I didn't think about, I listed the fundamental thinking methods, but I guess I could extend that with tools like analogy, which I completely forgot about. And there's probably tons more. Like you gave the example of what would be, I forgot, what would have to change in reality for this thing to be true. I remember you gave that kind of it. That was cool. Where are more of those?
Nowhere, I don't think. I should write them myself. Like I've been working on writing things like that.
Yeah, that would be.
I want to write more of it. I plan to.
Even to that fundamental thinking methods thing, like I could probably just add tons. There's probably tons of those that you could find and collect and then practice applying them in lots of different situations, right?
Yeah, I know a lot actually. It's gonna write them down.
Yeah.
I know a lot of things like that.
Okay, cool. Let's see. Oh, okay. Next thing is logical progression of the events. I'm breaking this down for analysis. Logic, so art of, or a skill or an art in applying the law of identity to concepts or propositions was my definition. But then when I say logical progression of events, like it's something else, something has changed. Like suddenly my definition doesn't really seem to be relevant. Like I remember a logical progression of events, according to Rand's definition, was something like a plot driven by volition. But then how is that related? At least with my definition of logic, suddenly I'm like, well, how is this now applicable in when I read? Like, I spent some time defining logic as art or skill of applying the law of identity to concepts or propositions. That was my definition. And suddenly I'll read logical, the plot is a logical progression of events. I'm like, well, what? Like that's not my definition doesn't really, something is going wrong with my definition.
I think it's more the idea that A follows B. I think it's the same principle that a character, like if you kill the character's wife, it's gonna cause a. I mean, it's not like he'll be happy. I mean, there's something implied by the way the reality's been designed and created that would imply maybe what would be a reasonable way they would react, logical in this sense. Would A follow B, or would B follow A? Which I do think is a lot related to that, because causality is just B being caused by A, and
Right.
logic would be an aspect of that, identifying how does A lead to B. So it would be, in a way, is plot would be a logical progression, because it's trying to set out the course of events of B following A.
Okay. But then my definition is something like, okay, if I spend this time to clarify concepts and I get this definition, now I'm like, it doesn't seem to help me really in this, at least in this proposition. Like if I looked at the concept on its own, I'm like, oh, now I know what logic is. But then if I read a book and suddenly they're talking about a logical, it doesn't seem to actually help. You know what I'm saying? Because this doesn't fit in with this. Like the fact that I've spent time clarifying that's what logic is doesn't tell me, oh, okay, so what
Oh, it doesn't tell you what plot is.
No, it doesn't tell me what logical progression of events is. If I've spent time defining it, unless I've defined it wrong.
It looks like you defined it fine. I think if you're just having a hard time applying it to this new context. I mean, if you want to just think logical progression, how is that different than just logic? I mean, you're adding progression here. What are we trying to say by saying progression?
Non-contradictory, like one event causes another, rather than there's no cause for the event. Or, oh, hang on a second, maybe that's what no cause for the event, right? It's a thing that just happens.
Yeah.
Like a miracle.
Yeah, that wouldn't be much of a plot now, would it? It's just like happenings. Not even, you want to call it a plot, really. Not
Yeah,
like
okay.
if you're reading Atlas Shrugged, I mean, there's a plot because the events follow each other in a sensible way. It's not like,
Right.
oh, there's a strike and then the world collapses. Like, no, she presented everything in a way that this result makes sense, that you
Right.
could imagine this, that is logical.
Okay. So it's almost applying the law of identity then to a series of events in a novel. Like one, like you pointed out, A causes B, B causes C, that kind of thing, maybe.
Yeah.
And maybe that's my understanding of law of identity and its relationship to causality. But the reason I brought this up, it seems like such a small thing, was just because I was like, well, all right, I spent all this time clarifying this, and now it doesn't seem to, like you said, I couldn't quite figure out, okay, well, I'm not suddenly more insightful when I'm reading something like this. But anyway, what you're saying makes sense. So